In January of 1889, in the bitter iron cold of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a 15-year-old black boy named Jonah Fields stood in a basement room beneath the humming skeleton of the Westinghouse Works, and did something that made grown men forget how to breathe. A chalkboard filled the wall like a confession. 7 equations. Alternating current. The kind of mathematics that did not merely test intelligence. It punished it. For 13 weeks, a hand-picked team of European-trained physicists had circled these symbols like wolves around a locked door. They had argued in German and English. They had erased lines until the board looked bruised. They had blamed the tools, the assumptions, the weather, anything but themselves. Then Jonah lifted the chalk. He solved the first equation in 11 minutes. The second in 9. By the time he reached the fourth, the room had shifted. Quiet not like politeness, but like fear. The kind of silence that arrives when a belief dies in public. Men who had built their lives on a certain order of the world, white above black, educated above poor, watched a boy in worn shoes and patched sleeves step through their locked door as if it had never been locked at all. And there, among them, stood George Westinghouse, a man who had wagered his fortune on this new current, a man who could afford to be arrogant, and could not afford to be wrong. Because what Westinghouse saw that day did not merely threaten Edison's war on electricity. It threatened something older, something far more violent. And by the end of that winter, after one choice made behind closed doors, Jonah Fields would disappear from the story Americans told themselves about progress, while the world around them lit up with power built on work that would never carry his name. What really happened in that basement? What did Jonah solve? And what did his genius cost? Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit the bell, and comment your city below, because stories like this were buried on purpose. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Jonah Fields was born in April of 1874, across the river from Pittsburgh proper in Allegheny City, a place that never truly slept. Even when the street lamps dimmed and the mill whistles stopped calling men to work, the air still tasted of metal and soot, as if the city's lungs could not remember how to breathe clean. Allegheny was not the romantic North people spoke of in sermons. It was industry packed tight, brick tenements leaning shoulder to shoulder, alleys stained with coal dust, and a river that carried the smell of waste and wages in the same black water. The sky, when it bothered to show itself, looked bruised most days, pinned under a lid of smoke from the furnaces and rolling mills. Jonah's father, Moses Fields, worked at Jones and Laughlin, one of the steel outfits that turned men into tools and tools into scrap. Moses had been born enslaved on a tobacco plantation in Virginia. He did not speak of it often, but when he did, his voice went quiet in a way that made the room feel smaller. "I learned letters like a thief learns locks," he once told Jonah, sitting on the edge of their bed with his boots still on. Slow, careful, always listening for footsteps. He had taught himself to read by the Bible, whispering verses under his breath so no one would notice he understood the symbols on the page. After the war, he had walked north on blistered feet, following rumors the way starving men followed smells. Pennsylvania was supposed to be different. The chains were gone, but the rules remained. They just wore cleaner clothes. Jonah's mother, Clara Fields, had been born free in Philadelphia, raised in a church household where words mattered and dignity was treated like an inheritance. She could read, write, and cipher better than most women she knew, black or white. But freedom had not protected her from hunger. In Allegheny, she earned money as a laundress for families in Pittsburgh's East End, working over steaming water until her hands cracked and bled. Lye soap burned like a secret punishment. The heat warped the fingers. The work never ended. Their home was a 2-room apartment in a tenement shared mostly by Irish and Polish immigrants, people who, on paper, were poor like them, but who clung to whiteness like it was a life raft. Some were kind. Many were not. Jonah learned early that a smile could carry teeth behind it. Clara noticed Jonah was different before she had language for genius. When he was 3, she found him on the floor, buttons and pennies arranged into careful shapes, circles nested inside squares, lines branching like a map. His small hands moved with reverence, placing each object where it belonged as if he could see a pattern the rest of the world was blind to. "What are you doing, baby?" Clara asked. Jonah looked up, his eyes too steady for a toddler. "They fit better this way," he said. "When they're right, they stop arguing." Clara laughed at first, then stopped, because Jonah did not sound like a child playing. He sounded like someone solving something. By 5, Jonah could add and subtract in his head faster than Clara could write numbers on paper. He watched his father count wages, coins separated into piles, and Jonah would say the total before Moses finished. Moses would freeze, then glance toward the door as if someone might have been listening. "Keep that to yourself," he warned Jonah once, voice low. You don't show everything you got. Not out here. Why? Jonah asked. Moses stared at him for a long moment as if weighing the truth. Because the world punishes black boys who make white men feel small. Clara hated hearing Moses speak that way because it meant he was right. She had seen it too, the way certain white women stiffened when Jonah spoke too clearly. The way certain men narrowed their eyes when Jonah answered questions without hesitation. A smart black child did not look like innocence to them. It looked like rebellion. Still, Clara refused to dim him. When Jonah turned 6, she enrolled him in the Negro school, a one-room building that smelled of chalk dust and damp wool, taught by a woman named Miss Harriet Thompson, a stern, warm-eyed teacher who carried her authority like a lantern. Within weeks, Miss Thompson sent a note home. When Moses and Clara arrived after work, Miss Thompson greeted them with a tight expression that tried to hide her astonishment. Your son is reading beyond my older students, she said. And he is teaching himself mathematics from my desk book. He comes early. He stays late. He solves problems I did not assign. Moses shifted in his chair, fingers gripping his hat. That's good, he said, though it came out like a question. It is good, Miss Thompson agreed. Then her face softened into something heavier. But I must be honest, this school ends at 8th grade. Even our brightest children hit the ceiling. Jonah will reach it sooner than the rest. And a mind like his does not forgive confinement. Clara leaned forward, hope rising like a flame. What about the white schools? Miss Thompson didn't laugh. She didn't need to. The silence answered. No white school in Pittsburgh will accept him, she said quietly. Not as a student. Not as a curiosity. Not as proof. They do not want him inside their walls. Moses exhaled through his nose, bitter and tired. That's what I've been saying. But Clara's spine straightened. Then we build him another way. That was the beginning of the hunt. Clara began collecting books the way starving people collected bread. She asked wealthy families, politely, carefully, if they had old textbooks their children no longer used. Some handed her worn volumes with a kind of distant charity. Some did it with amusement, as if giving a black boy algebra was a parlor trick. Clara accepted it all. She found a damaged geometry text behind a private academy, pages warped by rain but still readable. She traded laundry work for a professor's old algebra manual. She spent pennies at second-hand shops on anything that smelled like knowledge. And Jonah devoured every page. He studied by candlelight before dawn, while the city outside still muttered in its sleep. He copied theorems into notebooks with cramped handwriting to save paper. He worked until his head ached, then kept going, not because he was forced but because the numbers called him. Sometimes Moses would wake in the night and find Jonah still bent over his book, lips moving as he calculated silently. Boy, Moses whispered once, half anger, half fear, you gone burn yourself out. Jonah didn't look up. I'm not tired, Papa. I'm close. Close to what? Jonah paused, eyes fixed on the page as if he could see through it. To the place where it all makes sense. Moses stared at his son in the dim light, and something cold settled in his chest. Because Moses understood the danger of that kind of hunger. A black boy chasing sense in a world built on nonsense. And none of them knew it yet, but 3 years later, a German professor would hear a voice beneath an open window in Oakland, and Jonah Fields would step across a line that could not be uncrossed. Because once a secret is proven in public, the world does not forgive it. The summer of 1886 arrived in Allegheny City without mercy. Heat settled between the buildings like a held breath, thick with the smell of oil, horse sweat, and river rot. The mills worked harder in summer, and so did the people who fed them. Men staggered home with their shirts stiff from dried sweat. Women leaned over wash basins until their shoulders screamed. Children learned early to move out of the way. Jonah was 12 that summer, tall for his age, thin as a question mark, his mind already running far ahead of the body that carried it. He had finished everything Miss Thompson could give him and was now living almost entirely in the margins of books meant for men twice his age. Calculus had stopped feeling foreign. Geometry felt like grammar. Numbers were no longer symbols. They were shapes, landscapes, sometimes voices. Clara sent him across the river twice a week to deliver clean laundry to homes in Oakland, where professors from the Western University of Pennsylvania lived among trees that actually stayed green. Jonah liked walking there. The air felt different, less heavy, less angry. He liked the quiet too. He gave his thoughts room to stretch. That was how he ended up beneath the wrong window. He was halfway down a tree-lined street when he heard shouting, not the drunken kind, not the kind that came from factory floors, but sharp, frustrated words spoken by someone who expected the world to obey logic. This is impossible, the voice barked, thick with a German accent. The boundary conditions do not reconcile. It should converge, but it refuses. Jonah slowed. He should have kept walking. Moses's warnings echoed in his head. Do not attract attention. Do not correct white men. Do not speak unless spoken to. But the words pouring from that open window were not insults or orders. They were mathematics. Partial differential equations. Heat flow. Periodic functions. Jonah stopped completely. He stood there, laundry basket cutting into his arm, listening as the unseen man paced, muttering about divergence and error terms. Jonah's mind assembled the problem instinctively, like hands reaching for familiar tools. He knew the mistake before he knew he was speaking. Sir, Jonah called up, his voice cutting through the heat. If you're using Fourier methods, you need to check the boundary behavior at the discontinuities. That's usually where the divergence hides. Silence. The shouting stopped so abruptly it felt like a physical blow. For a moment, Jonah thought, hoped, the man had not heard him. Then a face appeared in the window. Wild gray hair. Steel-framed spectacles. Eyes that did not blink. What did you say? The man demanded. Jonah swallowed. Too late now. I said the problem might be at the discontinuities, he repeated. If the boundary conditions aren't handled carefully, the series won't converge. The man vanished from the window. Jonah's heart began to pound. He should leave. Right now. Before. The front door flew open. The man stood there in house slippers, shirt half-buttoned, looking at Jonah the way naturalists looked at rare animals. How, he said slowly, do you know about Fourier transformations? Jonah shifted the basket. I read about them, sir. You read about them, the man repeated. Where? In a textbook. My mother found it. The man stared at him as if the words had failed to translate. How old are you? 12. I'll be 13 in April. For a long moment, the man said nothing. Then he stepped aside. Come in. Jonah hesitated. I will not harm you, the man snapped as if insulted by the implication. But if you walk away now, I will regret it for the rest of my life. Jonah stepped inside. The study smelled of ink, dust, and something sharp. Ozone, maybe, from the experiments cluttering the room. A chalkboard covered the far wall, layered with equations like scars. Jonah's eyes moved across them involuntarily, spotting errors the way some people spotted crooked pictures. The man followed his gaze. Can you see it? He asked, voice tight. Jonah nodded and stepped closer, chalk already in his hand. Here, he said, pointing. When you integrated this term, the sign flipped. Everything after that carries the error. The man rushed forward, breath quickening. It took him minutes to confirm what Jonah had seen in seconds. When he did, his face drained of color. My God, he whispered. He turned to Jonah. My name is Professor Heinrich Muller. And you, young man, are either lying to me, or you are something I have never seen. Jonah met his eyes. I'm not lying, sir. Muller sank into his chair. Can you solve these equations yourself? He asked. Not correct mine. Solve them. Yes, sir. The professor laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Then he went to a cabinet and pulled out a folder thick with papers. These are problems I give my doctoral students, he said. Some I solved. Some I am not certain can be solved. Take them. Work on them. Bring them back in 1 week. Jonah accepted the folder as if it were sacred. That week nearly broke him. He slept in fragments. He ate without tasting. Clara found him hunched over his notebook at 2 a.m, candle burned low, eyes red but alive with fire. Jonah, she whispered, you need rest. Soon, he murmured. I'm almost through the hard part. When he returned to Muller's house 7 days later, he carried solutions to 17 problems, partial proofs to 2, and a demonstration that the final problem contained contradictory assumptions. Muller spent 3 hours checking the work. When he finished, tears stood in his eyes. This, he said hoarsely, is the work of a mature mathematical mind. He looked at Jonah as if seeing the future and fearing it at the same time. I want to teach you, Muller said. Quietly, carefully. I cannot change the world, but I can give you tools. What Jonah did not yet understand was that this moment, the open window, the chalk, the invitation, had already changed everything. Because once white authority witnesses black brilliance up close, it must choose. And history is written by the choices men make when they are afraid. Professor Muller did not bring Jonah to the university. He did not announce him to colleagues or parade him as proof of anything. He understood the city too well for that. Instead, the education began in silence, tucked behind drawn curtains and locked doors, twice a week in the professor's study where the chalkboard still bore the ghosts of arguments long finished. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, Jonah crossed the river after school, his books wrapped in cloth, his steps measured. The neighbors noticed him. They always did. A black boy walking alone through Oakland drew eyes the way blood drew flies. Some curious, some angry, some calculating. Inside the study, the world rearranged itself. Muller taught Jonah as he would have taught a doctoral student, without indulgence, without simplification. Advanced calculus, differential equations, complex variables. He moved quickly, expecting resistance. He did not get it. Jonah absorbed ideas the way dry earth absorbed rain. He did not merely understand methods, he questioned their foundations. He did not accept proofs as finished things. He tested them, turned them, searched for the hidden assumptions beneath the elegance. You do not think linearly, Muller observed one evening, watching Jonah bridge a problem in number theory to a geometric argument without hesitation. You think spatially, structurally. Jonah shrugged. They're the same thing, sir. Just wearing different clothes. Muller laughed, then stopped laughing. Because that kind of thinking, the ability to see mathematics as a single, unified landscape, was rare even among professionals. It was the mark of creators, not technicians. But every lesson carried weight. Moses worried constantly. Each time Jonah left the apartment at dusk, he imagined shadows that followed him, imagined fists, knives, uniforms. He had lived too long to believe that brilliance protected black men. If anything, it made them targets. You're becoming visible, Moses warned one night, voice low. That's dangerous. Jonah understood. He felt it too, the way conversations stopped when he entered certain spaces, the way white men's faces hardened when he spoke too confidently. He learned to modulate his voice, to choose words carefully, to fold himself smaller in public. In Muller's study, he unfolded again. By 14, Jonah was solving problems that had no place in high school or even most universities. Muller introduced texts in German and French, teaching Jonah enough of each language to read mathematics untranslated. The boy moved between tongues effortlessly, caring only about the ideas beneath the words. You could publish, Muller said once, then shook his head. No, not yet. Not like this. Jonah already knew why. The American mathematical world was closed. Membership required degrees. Degrees required institutions. Institutions did not open their doors to boys like Jonah. Even Muller, white, European-trained, respected, could not force that gate. Sometimes Jonah asked the question anyway. What is the point, he said quietly one evening, chalk dust on his fingers, of discovering things no one will let me name? Muller had no good answer. He spoke instead of patience, of time, of the long arc of truth. Jonah listened, but something burned behind his ribs. He had grown up watching men break their bodies in mills while others claimed the profit. He knew how easily labor disappeared into someone else's legacy. And then in January of 1889, the quiet ended. Muller arrived one evening with a stack of papers he did not immediately place on the desk. His face looked older, tight. These are from Westinghouse Electric, he said. Alternating current, power transmission, harmonic instability. Their European physicists are stuck. Jonah leaned forward. I cannot solve them, Muller admitted. But I believe you can. Jonah scanned the equations. His mind ignited. Periodic functions. Phase relationships. New territory but familiar terrain. There's no standard method, Jonah said slowly. They're forcing tools that don't belong. Yes, Muller agreed. Which means something new, Jonah finished. Muller hesitated. If you solve these, Jonah, you must present them yourself. Jonah looked up sharply. They will not accept work attributed to me, Muller continued. They will ask questions. They will test the reasoning. And they will see you. They sat in silence. Jonah knew what that meant. A room full of white engineers. Skepticism sharpened into hostility. A black teenager standing where he was not supposed to stand. I'm tired of hiding, Jonah said at last. If they want the truth, they can look at it. Muller nodded, pride and fear tangled together. Jonah worked for 3 days without stopping. He slept on the floor beside his papers. He ate whatever Clara pressed into his hands without tasting it. He tore through false starts, discarded entire approaches, then, slowly, found a path no one else had seen. By Sunday night, the equations lay solved. 6 cleanly. 1 transformed entirely. He had invented a new mathematical approach, not borrowed, not adapted, but created, to manage phase relationships in polyphase systems. When Muller saw it, he understood immediately. "This is not just engineering," he whispered. "This is mathematics." The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Muller did not tell Westinghouse Jonah's age or his race. He simply said he had found the solution. The morning Jonah walked toward the Westinghouse gates, dressed in a suit too small for his growing body, Clara straightened his collar with trembling hands. "You must be perfect," she said softly. "They won't forgive mistakes." Moses placed a hand on Jonah's shoulder. "Remember who you are." Jonah nodded and walked on. And none of the men waiting in that basement laboratory understood that the world they believed in, the one where genius had a color, was about to fracture in front of them. Because once a truth is written in chalk, it cannot be erased cleanly. The basement laboratory beneath Westinghouse Electric smelled of hot metal, damp stone, and ambition. Steam pipes rattled like old bones in the walls. A single row of gas lamps threw hard light across benches cluttered with instruments, coils, and stacks of paper scarred by erasures. It was a room built for men who expected the world to yield if they pressed it hard enough. They had been pressing for months. 7 equations filled the chalkboard, dense, unforgiving, alive with phase angles and periodic terms that refused to settle. For 13 weeks, the men gathered there had argued in clipped English and sharper German. They had accused assumptions, blamed instruments, redrawn diagrams until the board looked wounded. Nothing held. When Professor Muller entered, the room quieted with the thin courtesy owed to a consultant. When Jonah followed, the quiet curdled. "Hinrich," one of the German physicists snapped, not bothering to lower his voice. "What is this?" Muller did not flinch. "This is Jonah Fields, the mathematician who solved the equations." A ripple ran through the room, disbelief hardening into irritation, irritation edging toward anger. A black boy, 15. No papers. No degree. No right. One man laughed outright. Another folded his arms, jaw tight. A third stared as if insulted. George Westinghouse raised a hand. The gesture was small, but it carried weight. "Gentlemen," he said even and calm, "Professor Muller has not wasted my time before. If he says this young man has answers, we will hear them. Mr. Fields, please." Jonah's heart hammered. He could feel eyes on his back like hands. He stepped forward, lifted the chalk, and the room narrowed to the board. He began with the first equation. He did not rush. He spoke clearly, walking them through the structure before the solution, showing where the existing methods failed and why. He wrote with economy, no flourish, no apology. When he finished, he stepped back. 11 minutes. The second followed faster. 9 minutes. He anticipated objections and answered them before they were voiced. When a physicist interrupted with a challenge, Jonah turned, listened, then corrected him gently, precisely, using the man's own assumptions. By the fourth equation, the room had changed. The hostility drained into something else. Attention sharpened. Pens stopped scratching. Men leaned forward without realizing they had moved. Jonah did not just compute. He explained. He showed how the mathematics behaved, how periodic systems whispered to one another, how phase relationships could be tamed if approached from the right angle. He drew connections they had not seen, bridged ideas they had kept separate. Questions came, probing, suspicious, technical. Jonah answered every one. Sometimes he went deeper than the problem required, not to show off, but because that was where the truth lived. The seventh equation waited like a trap. 3-phase power. Transformers with mismatched windings. Coherence demanded across distance. The methods on the board had failed again and again. Jonah paused. "This approach won't close," he said quietly. "It's forcing symmetry where there isn't any." He erased a section, an audacity that sent a murmur through the room, and began again. What followed was not correction. It was creation. Jonah introduced a transformation none of them had seen, derived from first principles, built to respect the system's behavior rather than dominate it. As he worked, a Swiss engineer stood up, eyes wide. "Wait," he said. "This isn't limited to power systems. This could apply to any periodic structure with phase coupling." Jonah nodded. "Yes, sir. That's why I didn't adapt an existing method. The problem needed a new one." Silence. Not disbelief. Recognition. Westinghouse broke it. "How old are you, Mr. Fields?" 15, sir." "And where did you learn this?" "At home." "And with Professor Muller?" "No university?" "No, sir." Westinghouse studied him, not with curiosity now but calculation. He asked about assumptions, limits, edge cases. Jonah answered without hesitation. Finally, Westinghouse said, "If I offered you a position here, working on these problems, would you accept?" The room inhaled. Jonah chose his words carefully. Sir, I would accept if the work allows me to contribute meaningfully. But I need to be honest. Hiring me will anger people. I don't want my presence to undermine your program. Westinghouse smiled, a small, genuine curve of respect. I hire solutions. You have brought one. The rest is my concern. He turned to the room. Anyone who cannot work with Mr. Fields professionally will find other employment. Is that understood? It was. Some nodded with relief. Others with resignation. A few with quiet admiration. Outside, the city exhaled smoke. Inside, something older than electricity had shifted. Jonah walked out beside Muller, legs trembling now that the work was done. You changed things, Muller said softly. Jonah shook his head. I showed them something. What they do with it, that's the real test. Neither of them knew yet how carefully Jonah's name would be hidden in the months to come. How his work would light cities while his credit dimmed. How success would bring both protection and danger. But in that basement, belief had collapsed. And once broken, it would never sit the same way again. Jonah Fields began working for Westinghouse Electric in February of 1889, but there was no announcement. No notice in the papers. No welcome from the engineering staff. His employment entered the company the same way he did, quietly, carefully, through a side door that could be closed if necessary. Officially, Jonah was listed as a junior mathematical assistant. The title meant nothing. It was chosen precisely because it sounded harmless. It allowed Westinghouse to pay him without explaining why a black teenager was doing work that normally required European degrees and white skin. Jonah was given a small room at the edge of the laboratory floor. A desk. A chalkboard. Access to problem sets that made seasoned engineers sweat. He ate lunch alone. He left before social gatherings began. He learned quickly where he was welcome and where he was merely tolerated. But the mathematics did not care. Within weeks, Jonah was solving problems faster than the men assigned to them. He developed methods for calculating power loss over long-distance transmission that reduced error margins enough to make AC systems commercially viable. He found ways to stabilize phase synchronization that no existing manual addressed. Engineers began coming to his door. At first they came stiffly. Professional. Polite in the way men were polite to something they did not fully respect. They asked questions, took notes, left without conversation. Then they came back. By summer, Jonah's desk was never clear. Papers piled. Chalk dust coated his cuffs. His notebooks filled with transformations, approximations, ideas that would later be called innovations. But never with his name attached. Westinghouse noticed. He did not praise Jonah publicly, but he protected him fiercely. When questions arose about calculations, Westinghouse directed them to Jonah without explanation. When engineers complained about unconventional workflow, Westinghouse ended the discussion. Still, protection had limits. Jonah's name did not appear on patents. His contributions were folded into reports credited to others, usually senior white engineers whose authority made investors comfortable. Jonah understood the politics. He hated them anyway. You are building the future, Muller told him once. Even if they do not carve your name into it yet. Jonah nodded, but the injustice settled deeper each time he watched someone else receive credit for work he had done. The tension crystallized in May of 1889. A senior engineer named Robert Kensington had never hidden his contempt. He avoided Jonah when possible. When he could not, his politeness was sharp-edged, brittle. Kensington believed hierarchy was natural, necessary. A black teenager solving problems he could not felt like a personal insult. Kensington made his move quietly. He altered a set of Jonah's calculations prepared for a presentation to investors. Small changes. Decimal shifts. A reverse sign. Just enough to produce instability in the final results. Then he brought the errors to Westinghouse with grave concern. This, Kensington said, tapping the page, is why we cannot rely on uncredentialed help. Westinghouse said nothing. He handed the papers to Jonah. Jonah read them once. Then again. His stomach dropped. These aren't my numbers, Jonah said evenly. Someone changed them. Are you accusing my staff of sabotage? Kensington snapped. Jonah did not look at him. He pulled out a second copy. Then a third. Original calculations, dates intact. The originals are correct, Jonah said. These were altered. Silence filled the office. Westinghouse dismissed Kensington on the spot. No discussion. No appeal. But the damage lingered. Jonah learned that brilliance did not protect him from malice. That some men would rather see failure than accept a truth that rearranged their place in the world. He began keeping duplicates of everything, 3 copies stored separately. He documented conversations. He trusted fewer people. The work continued. Word spread through quiet channels. Engineers from other firms visited. Some left skeptical. Some left shaken. A few left changed. In 1890, Jonah received an invitation to present at a regional meeting of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers in Philadelphia. The invitation came from an ally, not the institution itself. When organizers realized a black teenager was scheduled, they tried to cancel. The ally threatened scandal. Jonah spoke anyway. He stood before a nearly full hall in the same ill-fitting suit, hands trembling until the mathematics steadied him. For 45 minutes, he explained ideas that reshaped how power moved through space. He answered questions without flinching. The applause lasted 5 minutes. Jonah cried openly. For the first time, he felt seen. But visibility carried its own cost. Letters arrived. Anonymous. Angry. A brick shattered the window of his family's new house with a note attached. Know your place. Clara hid the note. Jonah found it anyway. By 1891, Jonah made a discovery that should have secured his place in mathematical history. A theorem about differential equation stability that reached far beyond engineering. Muller confirmed it. They submitted it under Jonah's name. It was rejected. Not for errors. For lack of credentials. Muller offered to publish it under his own name. Jonah refused. I won't help erase myself, he said. The theorem would be rediscovered decades later. Under a white name. By 1894, Jonah understood the truth. He could change the world's machines, but not its memory. So he made another choice. He stayed. He taught. He built a bookstore. A school. A quiet rebellion rooted in knowledge. He raised children who would walk paths denied to him. Jonah Fields would power cities and educate generations, while history pretended he had never stood at the chalkboard. But chalk leaves residue. And years later, someone would notice the dust and ask who had been there first. Jonah Fields did not leave Westinghouse in anger. He left the way tired men leave battles they know will never end, with resolve sharpened by clarity. By 1905, he had learned the shape of the ceiling above him. He could push against it, bruise it, even crack it in places, but it would never open wide enough for him to pass through as an equal. So he stepped sideways. The bookstore opened on a narrow street in Pittsburgh's Hill District, its windows crowded with second-hand textbooks, scientific journals, and notebooks bound with string. There was no sign announcing ambition. Just a door that stayed open and a man who believed knowledge should not require permission. At night, Jonah taught. Boys who worked days hauling coal. Girls who cleaned houses and learned equations by lamplight. He taught algebra, geometry, calculus, not as abstractions, but as languages that described the world honestly. He taught them how to think, how to doubt, how to test claims made by people who assumed authority without proof. Numbers, he told them, do not lie for anyone. Some students left when the work became hard. Others stayed and bloomed. A few would go on to teach others, building a quiet network of minds the city could not see but could not erase. Jonah married Alice Thornton, a schoolteacher who understood the cost of vision. Together they raised 4 children. Jonah taught them mathematics the way other fathers taught prayer, patiently, deliberately, with reverence. His son, Marcus, would later earn a doctorate in mathematics. Jonah attended the ceremony without bitterness, pride swelling where regret once lived. Professor Muller died in 1912. In his will, he left Jonah his books, his papers, and a memoir, careful, precise, documenting their work together. The memoir went to an archive. It slept there for decades. Jonah lived long enough to see the world begin, just barely, to shift. Black scholars entered universities. Journals opened their doors a crack. But progress moved the way glaciers move, slow, crushing, indifferent to those buried beneath it. He died in 1954, 80 years old, his bookstore still open, his students still teaching. The black newspapers marked his passing. The white ones did not. For a time that seemed like the end. But history is a patient thing. In the 1970s, a graduate student researching early AC power stumbled across correspondence in the Westinghouse archives. A name appeared again and again: Jonah Fields. Not an engineer. Not a clerk. A consultant. A mathematician. The student kept digging. Muller's memoir resurfaced. Not as legend. As documentation. Chalked equations. Dates. Handwriting. Proofs. Slowly papers were written. Arguments made. Claims challenged. Some historians resisted. They always do when truth threatens comfort. But mathematics is stubborn. The theorem Jonah discovered in 1891 was re-examined. His proof predated the credited discovery by decades. The priority was undeniable. Universities established scholarships in his name. Departments spoke of him in lectures. Carefully. Sometimes reluctantly. Jonah Fields re-entered history the same way he had entered the basement at Westinghouse. Quietly, undeniably, carrying work that spoke for itself. Yet even then the arguments did not stop. Was he truly original? Was he merely applying ideas others had developed? The same doubts that had followed him in life followed him into memory. And still the evidence held. Jonah Fields had done the work. His story does not ask for myth. It asks for honesty. How many others like him never found a Professor Muller? How many minds burned out unseen because the world refused to imagine them? How many theorems died in notebooks? How many inventions vanished into silence? Jonah understood something most never do, that genius is not rare. Opportunity is. And when opportunity is hoarded, humanity starves itself. What he left behind was not just mathematics. It was a challenge. To ask who else was erased. To question whose names we repeat. To understand that progress built on injustice is still indebted. The lights powered by Jonah's work never flickered. The question is whether we will. What do you think Jonah's story tells us about the history we were taught, and the history we weren't? Leave your thoughts below. If you want more stories like this, stories pulled from the margins and written back into memory, subscribe, share, and stay with us. Because the truths they tried to bury are still speaking. And once heard, they do not go quiet again. Years after Jonah Fields was gone, long after the chalk dust had settled and the mills along the river had rusted into memory, people would ask the wrong question. They would ask whether Jonah was real. Whether the stories had grown in the telling. Whether a black boy in the 1880s could truly have understood mathematics at that level. Whether the papers, the letters, the notebooks meant what later historians claimed they meant. It was easier to doubt than to reckon. Because accepting Jonah Fields meant accepting something far more uncomfortable, that the history of American science was not merely incomplete, but selectively edited. That brilliance had been present in places power refused to look. That progress had depended on minds it deliberately kept invisible. The resistance was not loud. It never is. It came wrapped in academic language. In footnotes that questioned credibility. In phrases like insufficient corroboration and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. As if Jonah had not already provided it. As if the mathematics themselves were not testimony. The truth was simpler. And crueler. If Jonah Fields was fully acknowledged, then the myth collapsed. The myth that intelligence flowed naturally toward whiteness, that exclusion was based on merit rather than fear, that history had unfolded fairly given the circumstances. Jonah's life proved otherwise. He had not failed to enter the canon because his work lacked rigor. He had failed to enter because the canon was guarded. By men who mistook gatekeeping for objectivity. By institutions that defined excellence in ways that conveniently mirrored themselves. And yet, Jonah's influence moved anyway. Quietly. Students he taught in church basements became teachers. Teachers became principals. Principals built schools that insisted black children could learn more than obedience. One of Jonah's students would later say, "He didn't teach us math. He taught us permission. Permission to question. Permission to doubt authority. Permission to believe that our minds were not accidents." By the mid-20th century, when black mathematicians finally began entering universities in visible numbers, some of them traced their intellectual lineage back, not through famous professors, but through Jonah's bookstore. Through notebooks copied by hand. Through lessons taught after long workdays. Jonah never asked for monuments. He distrusted them. They freeze stories, he once said. And stories need to move. But history has a way of circling back to what it tried to outrun. In the 1990s, a revised analysis of early AC power theory quietly corrected several attributions. Footnotes grew longer. Names shifted. Jonah Fields appeared, not as a headline but as a correction. That was enough. Because once a name is written into the record, it can be found again. Today, engineers still use methods descended from ideas Jonah developed. Students still solve equations whose ancestry runs through his notebooks. And every time someone insists that genius is rare, or that opportunity is earned rather than granted, Jonah's life stands as a rebuttal. Not dramatic, not mythic, just true. He was not an anomaly. He was evidence. Evidence of what happens when brilliance survives long enough to be noticed, and of how much brilliance never does. That is the part history still struggles to face. Because if Jonah Fields existed, and he did, then the question is not how exceptional was he. The real question is, how many others were never allowed to be? How many minds were lost to fields and factories and kitchens and back alleys because the world decided in advance who intelligence belonged to? How many breakthroughs arrived late because the people capable of making them were kept busy surviving? Jonah's story does not ask for pity. It asks for responsibility. To tell the full story. To examine whose work we inherit. To notice who is missing. And to understand that progress is not neutral. It reflects the choices of those who decide who gets to participate. Jonah Fields stood in a basement in 1889 and solved equations that terrified experts. But the most threatening thing he ever revealed was not mathematical. It was this: that the boundaries people defend most fiercely are rarely intellectual. They are imaginary. And imagination, once challenged, does not recover easily. If this story made you pause, if it unsettled something you thought you knew, share it. Talk about it. Pass it on. Because the stories they tried to erase are not gone. They are waiting. And the moment we listen, really listen, history begins to change. Long after the arguments quieted, after the footnotes were written and the symposiums concluded, Jonah Fields remained an uncomfortable presence in the margins of American history. Not because the evidence was weak, but because the implications were strong. Historians could accept that Jonah existed. They could accept that he was talented. Some would even accept that he was brilliant. What they resisted was the natural conclusion: that the systems which claimed to reward merit had, in fact, spent generations suppressing it. Jonah's life forced a reckoning with questions no institution likes to answer honestly. If a self-taught black teenager in the 1880s could outperform university-trained physicists, then what exactly were universities selecting for? If Jonah could derive original mathematics while barred from formal education, then what did credentials really measure? And if his work powered cities while his name was erased, then how many other invisible hands shaped the modern world? These questions unsettled people because they did not stay in the past. They leaked forward. They touched hiring committees, grant boards, admissions offices, peer review panels, places where power still disguised itself as neutrality. Jonah never framed his struggle in those terms. He had no interest in abstraction when people were hungry for clarity, but he understood injustice intuitively, the way some people understand weather. You can feel when the air is wrong, he once told a student, even if you cannot yet explain why. What Jonah felt, and what history later confirmed, was that talent alone never guarantees recognition. It only guarantees resistance. Because talent threatens hierarchies, and hierarchies defend themselves. Jonah's refusal to publish under another man's name was not stubbornness. It was foresight. He understood that credit is not vanity, it is survival. It determines who is remembered, who is funded, who is believed. When you surrender your name, you surrender your future. That lesson echoed far beyond mathematics. Black scientists in the early 20th century faced the same choice again and again. Publish anonymously, collaborate invisibly, or disappear. Many chose survival over recognition. Others chose dignity and paid the price. Jonah chose dignity. It cost him prestige. It cost him comfort. It cost him a place in textbooks written during his lifetime. But it preserved something harder to erase: truth. Because when historians finally uncovered his notebooks, they found consistency. Dates aligned. Proofs held. Methods predated credited discoveries. There was no myth to dismantle. Only silence to explain. And silence, when examined closely, always points back to power. Jonah's story also complicates the way we talk about firsts. The first black mathematician. The first black engineer. The first black professor. These labels comfort people. They suggest progress moves cleanly, one milestone at a time. Jonah disrupts that comfort. He shows that many firsts were never first at all, only first to be acknowledged. Others had come before. They simply left fewer records. Or their records were ignored. Or destroyed. Jonah survived because his work intersected with industry, with profit, with something white institutions could not afford to discard entirely. Even then they tried. What survived was not generosity. It was necessity. And that is not the same thing as justice. When students today learn about alternating current, they learn about systems, not people. About Edison and Westinghouse, not the unseen minds behind equations that made transmission possible. Jonah's absence is not accidental. It is instructional. It teaches us what history values and what it discards. Yet Jonah himself never wanted to be a symbol. When asked late in life if he regretted not leaving America, not seeking recognition elsewhere, he paused for a long time before answering. No, he said. Because if I had left, I would have proven only that escape is possible. By staying, I proved something harder, that resistance is too. He believed that knowledge planted locally could outgrow exclusion, that teaching one student who taught another could do more damage to injustice than any single publication. In that sense, Jonah Fields succeeded more deeply than history knows how to measure. His work lives not only in equations, but in people. In the confidence of students who refused to believe they were limited. In the quiet certainty that intelligence does not need permission. In the uncomfortable truth that brilliance has always existed outside the gates. What remains unanswered is not whether Jonah Fields mattered. That question has already been settled. What remains unanswered is whether we have learned anything from him. Because the structures that erased Jonah did not vanish with him. They adapted. They refined their language. They learned to exclude without appearing to. And so the final question Jonah leaves us with is not historical. It is present. Who are we still not listening to? Whose work do we still doubt reflexively? Whose names are missing from the stories we tell ourselves about progress? Jonah Fields stood at a chalkboard in 1889 and shattered a belief system. More than a century later, that belief system is still cracking. The sound it makes is quieter now, but it is still breaking. In the end, Jonah Fields was measured the way most black lives in America had always been measured, not by what he gave but by how easily his giving could be ignored. When he died, the lights of Pittsburgh did not dim. The power stations did not pause. The current flowed the same way it always had, clean, steady, indifferent. That was the cruelest proof of all. His work had become invisible because it worked too well. The city had absorbed him. That is what systems do to people who threaten them quietly. They do not crush them outright. They absorb them, dilute them, redistribute their labor until no single name can be attached to it. Jonah understood that long before his death. Late in life, a former student once asked him if he felt cheated, if he resented that others had built careers on foundations he had laid without acknowledgement. Jonah thought for a long moment before answering. Resentment is a luxury, he said finally. It assumes the world ever promised to be fair. I never believed that. I only believed it could be challenged. That was Jonah's final lesson. He did not believe justice arrived on its own. He believed it had to be taught. And teaching, unlike fame, compounds. By the time Jonah passed, the quiet network he had helped build was already larger than any single institution. His students were teaching in segregated schools, tutoring in kitchens, correcting textbooks that underestimated black minds. Some would go on to universities. Others would not. Both paths mattered. Because Jonah had never confused success with visibility. Visibility he knew could be revoked. Understanding could not. Historians would later argue about his significance. About whether his work truly changed mathematics, or whether it merely accelerated trends already underway. Jonah would have found that debate amusing. Mathematics does not care who arrives first. But history does. And history had arrived late to Jonah Fields. What ultimately secured his place was not sentiment or symbolism. It was documentation. The same thing he had trusted all along. Proofs, dates, consistency. The cold, unyielding logic of numbers that refused to bend to prejudice. Once uncovered, that logic could not be argued away. Not honestly. Yet even now, Jonah's story is not as widely known as it should be. It circulates in classrooms, in specialized texts, in communities that understand how often brilliance goes unrecognized. It does not yet live where it belongs, in the center. That absence is itself a lesson, because history is not just what happened. It is what we choose to repeat. Jonah Fields does not fit neatly into narratives that prefer clean heroes and singular geniuses. He complicates them. He demands that we acknowledge how much progress depends on people denied credit, how often advancement wears borrowed names. He also refuses despair. Despite everything taken from him, recognition, prestige, institutional belonging, Jonah never stopped believing in the power of ideas. Not as abstractions but as tools. Tools that could be passed hand to hand, mind to mind. In that sense, Jonah Fields was not erased. He was distributed. Across classrooms that never bore his name. Across equations that never cited him. Across students who carried his methods without knowing their origin. That kind of legacy does not announce itself. It persists. So when we ask what Jonah Fields ultimately accomplished, the answer is not found in archives alone. It is found in every moment someone refuses to accept an inherited limitation. In every student who questions why opportunity is rationed. In every scholar who looks at a footnote and asks whose work is missing. Jonah Fields proved something more durable than any theorem. He proved that intelligence is not the property of institutions. That genius does not require permission. And that truth, once demonstrated, cannot be permanently suppressed, only delayed. The delay cost generations. That is the part we must not soften. Because the harm of erasure is not only personal, it is collective. Humanity advances slower when talent is filtered through fear. Knowledge stagnates when brilliance is sorted by ancestry. Jonah knew this, and still he stayed. Still he taught. Still he believed that a boy counting in the dark could change the shape of the world. He was right. The only question left is whether we will recognize the next Jonah Fields while he is still alive, or whether we will once again wait for the archives to correct us decades too late. History has already given us the lesson. What we do with it now is the test. If Jonah Fields had lived in a world that rewarded truth immediately, his story would have ended differently. Shorter, cleaner, easier to tell. But history rarely grants that mercy. Instead, Jonah's life became a mirror held up to every generation that followed, each one forced to decide whether it would look closely or glance away and keep walking. Because the conditions that erased Jonah did not die with him. They learned how to hide. In the decades after his death, institutions perfected a new language. No longer did they say you cannot. They said you are not a fit. They replaced blunt exclusion with credential requirements, legacy pipelines, peer review systems that quietly favored the familiar. They spoke of neutrality while reproducing the same outcomes. Jonah would have recognized it instantly. He had seen how power adapted when challenged, how it shifted shape without surrendering control, how it learned to appear reasonable. That is why his story remains uncomfortable. It does not allow us to believe that injustice was simply a product of ignorance now corrected. It insists that injustice is often maintained consciously, defended politely, and enforced administratively. Jonah's brilliance was undeniable once placed in front of white authority. What followed was not celebration. It was containment. He was given just enough access to extract value, and no more. Just enough protection to keep him useful, and no more. His visibility was managed. His credit rationed. His future decided in rooms he was not invited into. That pattern repeats. We see it whenever marginalized brilliance is praised but not promoted, consulted but not credited, invited to speak but not to decide. Jonah Fields was not an exception to that pattern. He was an early case study. And the most revealing part of his life is not what he achieved under impossible circumstances, but what the system refused to let him become. He could have been a professor, a department chair, a published theorist shaping the next generation of mathematicians formally. Instead, he became something quieter, a multiplier. He turned one suppressed mind into many awakened ones. He transformed exclusion into distribution. If he could not enter the institutions that shaped knowledge, he would shape people who eventually would. That was not defeat. It was strategy. Jonah understood something modern discussions still struggle to articulate, that representation alone is not liberation. Access without power changes very little. Visibility without authority can become another form of control. He wanted his students to own their minds, not borrow them. That is why he taught fundamentals, why he insisted on proof, why he encouraged skepticism, not just of society but of himself. He did not want disciples. He wanted equals. Late in life, when asked what advice he would give young black scholars, Jonah answered without hesitation. Do not confuse recognition with worth. One is granted. The other is inherent. It was the kind of wisdom earned by watching credit drift away from you year after year, while truth stayed put. Jonah Fields never believed history would save him. He believed people might. That is the burden his story places on us. Not admiration, but responsibility. Because admiration without action is just another form of erasure. It freezes people into symbols and absolves us from changing the conditions that silence them. If Jonah's life teaches anything, it is that genius does not emerge where opportunity is abundant, it emerges everywhere. Opportunity merely decides who survives long enough to be noticed. And survival, as Jonah knew, is not the same as fulfillment. So when we tell his story, the point is not to marvel at how much he overcame. The point is to ask why he had to. Why a child had to teach himself calculus from discarded books. Why a teenager had to justify his presence to men who could not do his work. Why a lifetime of contribution could still end in footnotes and delayed recognition. Jonah Fields did not ask to be exceptional. He asked to be allowed. That request is still being denied, to different people in different ways under different names. Which means his story is not finished. It is still unfolding every time a gifted student is underestimated, every time talent is filtered through comfort, every time systems mistake tradition for merit. The measure of Jonah's life is not whether we finally place him where he belongs in history. It is whether we change the conditions that made his erasure possible in the first place. Until then, we are not honoring him. We are repeating him. There is a temptation when a story like Jonah Fields finally surfaces to treat it as a correction already made. To say, yes, that was wrong. Yes, we know better now. To file it away as a historical injustice acknowledged, resolved, archived. Jonah would have recognized that impulse for what it is. Relief. Relief that the reckoning can be kept safely in the past. But Jonah's life resists that comfort, because the forces that shaped his silence were not accidents. They were decisions, repeated, reinforced, and rationalized by people who believed themselves reasonable. Jonah never encountered a single villain who declared, "You must not exist." What he encountered instead were systems that said, "You may exist, but only here, only quietly, only temporarily, only without ownership." That distinction matters, because it means erasure does not require hatred. It requires administration. Jonah was erased by filing cabinets, by credential rules, by authorship conventions, by meetings he was not invited to, by decisions made politely, in rooms that smelled of ink and certainty. Those rooms still exist. They look different now. They use different language, but they still decide whose brilliance feels credible, whose success seems earned, whose ideas are considered original. Jonah Fields stands as a warning against believing progress is automatic. Progress, Jonah knew, is contested, and memory is one of its battlefields. When his story is told poorly, Jonah becomes a miracle, a rare exception that proves nothing. A single genius plucked from the margins to reassure us that talent always finds a way. But Jonah did not believe that. He believed talent finds resistance first. That is why he spent his life teaching others to recognize it. Not in stories, in structures. He taught his students how to question grading systems that confused compliance with intelligence, how to read scientific claims critically, how to ask who was missing from a bibliography, and why. Those lessons mattered more to him than accolades ever could. Because Jonah did not want to be remembered as extraordinary. He wanted to be understood as predictable. Predictable in a world where opportunity was evenly distributed. Predictable in a society that did not fear what it could not control. Predictable in a history that told the truth all at once instead of in fragments. That world did not exist for him. So he built something smaller, but stronger. A lineage. A way of thinking passed quietly, deliberately, from mind to mind. Resistant to erasure because it did not rely on recognition to survive. That may be Jonah's greatest legacy. Not that he solved equations others could not, but that he refused to let the meaning of intelligence be decided by those who benefited from narrowing it. When we say Jonah Fields was ahead of his time, we flatter ourselves. The truth is harsher. Jonah was exactly of his time. He understood it perfectly. Understood its limits, its fears, its hypocrisies. And he chose to work within them just enough to undermine them. That is why his story still unsettles. Because it asks something of us. Not applause. Not reverence, not nostalgia. It asks attention. Attention to who we listen to. Attention to whose work we doubt first. Attention to how often we mistake comfort for objectivity. Jonah Fields does not need us to admire him. He needs us to notice patterns. Because until those patterns change, there will always be another Jonah, working quietly, proving truths the world is not ready to accept, waiting for history to catch up. And history always does. The only question is how much is lost in the delay. So when you think about Jonah Fields, about the boy who counted in the dark, the teenager who broke a chalkboard silence, the man who chose teaching over erasure, do not ask whether he was great. Ask instead, what conditions made him invisible? Who benefited from that invisibility? And what would it take to ensure we do not repeat it? Because memory is not passive. It is chosen. And the stories we choose to remember shape the future we allow. Jonah Fields left us that choice. The rest is on us. In the end, Jonah Fields did not leave behind monuments. No statue marks the place where he stood with chalk trembling in his hand. No building bears his name in the city that ran on his work. No portrait hangs in the halls where decisions about knowledge and power were made without him. What he left instead was quieter, more dangerous. He left behind evidence. Evidence that brilliance does not need permission. Evidence that exclusion is a choice, not a law of nature. Evidence that history, when pressed hard enough, tells the truth. Eventually, Jonah understood something most people never have to learn the hard way, that recognition is not the same as impact. That names can be erased while consequences endure. That the world can benefit from your mind and still pretend it never met you. He made peace with that, not because it was just, but because surrender would have meant something worse. Silence. So he spoke where he could, taught where he was allowed, planted ideas where they could take root without permission. And those ideas survived him. They survived factories shutting down. They survived textbooks omitting his name. They survived historians arguing over footnotes instead of confronting systems. They survived because truth, once understood deeply enough, becomes portable. It moves with people. That is the part of Jonah's life history tried hardest to bury, and failed. Because when you trace the line forward, you see it clearly. From a boy counting buttons on a tenement floor, to a teenager correcting professors from beneath an open window, to a man who chose teaching over erasure, Jonah Fields did not disappear. He multiplied. He exists now in every student who refuses to believe intelligence has a color. In every researcher who questions why certain names are missing. In every mind that recognizes the difference between credential and capability. His life asks us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The greatest loss caused by injustice is not the suffering it creates. It is the progress it delays. Every mind denied opportunity slows humanity down. Every discovery buried pushes knowledge further into the future. Every Jonah Fields erased makes the world poorer than it needs to be. That loss is cumulative, and it is still happening. Which is why Jonah's story does not belong only to the past. It belongs to now. To classrooms where potential is misjudged. To institutions that confuse tradition with excellence. To societies that congratulate themselves for progress while repeating old patterns under new names. Jonah Fields never asked to be extraordinary. He asked to be allowed. That request is still being negotiated, by different people in different ways, every single day. So the question his life leaves us with is not whether history was unfair to him. That answer is obvious. The real question is this. What will we do differently because we know his story now? Will we keep treating brilliance as rare instead of suppressed? Will we keep mistaking silence for absence? Will we keep waiting decades to correct what we could choose to see today? Or will we learn to listen sooner? Because the next Jonah Fields is not waiting in an archive. He is alive somewhere right now, counting in the dark, solving problems no one asked him to touch, preparing to prove something the world is not ready to accept. Whether his name survives depends on what we do next. What do you think about Jonah Fields' story? Does it change how you see the history of science, or the way we recognize intelligence today? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, if it made you question what you were taught, subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the stories they tried to erase. And share this video with someone who believes our ancestors were only survivors, because they were also thinkers, builders, and architects of the modern world. These stories matter. These voices matter. And the truth does not stay buried forever. We'll see you in the next story, where we uncover another mind history tried to forget.